Hey, this is David Plotz, CEO of CityCast. I have a favor to ask before we get to today's conversation. We're doing our annual listener survey, and it would really help us out if you took it. And even if you took it last year, we'd be grateful if you took it again, because we can't use last year's data. Please go to citycast.fm/survey to take the survey. It's only 7 minutes long, we know, because we timed it. That's citycast.fm/survey. And when you take the survey, you'll also be eligible to win a $250 Visa gift card and CityCast swag, that great CityCast swag. citycast.fm/survey.
Today on CityCast Chicago, how is the city preparing for forthcoming ice raids? Will a major housing project bypass the local Alder? And can you name 1,000 things you love about Chicago? Joining me to answer all of these questions and more, WBEZ's Adriana Cardona Magigad and Block Club Chicago's Patrick Philbin. It's Friday, January 24th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Welcome to the podcast, my friends. Adriana, it's great to have you back.
Thank you, Jacoby. It's great to be here.
Patrick, this is your first time on CityCast Chicago. Welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me, Jacoby. Happy to be here.
We're going to have a nice 45-minute conversation about some of the biggest stories happening in and around the city this week. But before we get into that, if you've been listening for a minute, you maybe have heard me allude to the fact that we are soon coming up on 1,000 episodes of CityCast Chicago. We are less than, I believe, 2 months away from celebrating both 4 years and 1,000 episodes. And to celebrate, we're putting together a list of 1,000 things we love about Chicago. I think we are a little over halfway there at this point, mostly from suggestions from the immediate CityCast Chicago team, but we are tapping our friends, our listeners, readers to also participate. So Adriana, I'm gonna start with you. What's one or maybe a couple of things you love about the city of Chicago you want to put on our list?
I love the fact that Chicago and Chicagoans, we just have Chicago is like such a hardcore city when it comes to organizing. Covering immigration, I saw the grassroots organizing that happened when a lot of migrants were coming here about 2 years ago. And now I just been seeing just how much organizing is going around at the grassroots level, like deep grassroots, where people have been just really mobilizing to inform people about just their rights and just so much information that, it's needed. So I just really love that about Chicago.
It's something I knew very intimately, and yet over the last 4 years doing this podcast and getting to sit down with organizers who organize environmental justice efforts, affordable housing, labor efforts, protests against political violence, to see how much Chicago rides for its neighborhoods and its community members in so many different ways has been one of the brightest spots of doing this job over the last 4 years. So I'm glad. Let's go ahead and add that to our list, Chicago's fierce organizing spirit. Patrick, what about you? What's something you want to add to our 1,000 things we love about Chicago?
I was just thinking about how the city and like you said, kind of the communities, the neighborhoods really embrace each other in really unique ways. And there's, so many different aspects of neighborhoods in the city, but we all kind of collectively ride for each other and ride for kind of like the bigger picture in a way. And yeah, it really does kind of feel like a small town.
I love the fact that Chicago's like neighborhood culture can be both like a very insulating thing. Like I have like elders in my life who they live on the far south side, and you'll say something like, I'm going to the South Loop. And they're like, oh, you going up north. You going all the way up north. And so they are so insulated in their community and feel completely enriched and fed and engaged and involved in their community and don't feel like they ever have to leave their neighborhood in many ways. And yet, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, there are individuals in the city who can have all of those things in their neighborhood and still feel that idea, like you said, that we are this pocket of small towns and I can just go 2 or 3 different neighborhoods over and get a completely different vibe, a completely different set of restaurants, a completely different group of people who live in the city and have a completely different relationship to this city's history. That is probably one of the coolest things about growing up and living here is I'm still coming in contact with parts of the city I never knew existed. If you are listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, I have 100 things I can add to this list, then we put you to that test. Head over to chicago.citycast.fm and fill out our survey and tell us what you love about Chicago. You can also find the link in our show notes. Every single week on the podcast, we love to bring in our friends at the end of the week to talk about some of the biggest stories happening in their world on our front pages. And of course, I think it is very obvious that we are starting with the inauguration this week, but more specifically, this promise or rumor to conduct mass raids in major cities across the country. Places like Denver, DC, and of course, Chicago were named in these rumors. Adriana, you have been covering this very closely since they popped up over the weekend and how the city had been responding. One, did these raids happen in the Chicagoland area? And two, how are government officials and city agencies preparing themselves?
I haven't gotten reports, and I'm connected with just so many people across the city. There haven't been any reports of ICE agents here in the city yet. Just last month, President Donald Trump's border czar came to Chicago, and he pretty much announced like his biggest threat to the city. He said Chicago would be ground zero for mass deportations on like the day after, Trump's inauguration. And so that created a lot of fear. And even before, I would say, but after that threat, like a lot more communities and a lot more organizers, a lot more elected officials kind of like began creating these plans to really get ready in case something happened here in the city. And the plans just kind of like range the gamut. The threats of deportation starting here in Chicago, they didn't materialize on Tuesday, but what we saw is that, several executive orders that Trump issued, soon after he took office, continue kind of like to scare people and feel that that threat continues. For example, churches and schools are no longer designated safe zones. And so we're trying to figure out, okay, what does that mean in the school system? There's a lot of information going around about people's rights. Immigrants, regardless of their legal status in the country, they also have rights. They have the right to remain silent. They have the right to have some sort of due process. And the most important thing to understand is that if you're in a private property, in your private property, ICE agents need a warrant signed by an immigration judge or a judge to be able to come in looking for you. And I mean, a lot of advocates have been telling me that usually never happens. A lot of the arrests that ICE agents have made in the past are because they're intimidating people. They may have a warrant signed by an officer, which there's a difference there, but they might have warrants for 2 or 3 or maybe 10 people, but then they will just go and do collateral arrests and get more people to get to speak. And they use that by intimidating, by just kind of asking people for their immigration status. That's the type of education that a lot of advocates and experts are trying to kind of give to people. There's also a widespread of phone numbers for organizations that are helping, that will be helping people connect with attorneys in case they get detained. They created phone trees. And so a lot of advocates and people, residents, parent groups, they have these phone trees where if they see ICE coming in, they're going to spread the voice and just kind of talk to each other, verify those threats, and then just go to that point, to that site, and remind people about their rights, remind people kind of what they need to do in case they're being questioned. Yes, there was a lot of fear. There has been a lot of fear. I talked to undocumented people who are vendors on the streets, and they were telling me, like, there was a single mom who said, I really don't have anyone to leave my kids with. And she was really afraid, and she wasn't going to go out selling tamales as she usually does. Then I went on to the north side where people were role playing encounters with ICE. And the thing is, like, as exciting as like to know that there's a lot of people and residents out there watching, the worry and the concern too is that when you're there in front of an immigration official, a lot of things can, like you can get nervous. And so on the north side, they were doing these role plays of like, encounters with immigration, and just for people to really kind of learn what they'll say in case they encounter an immigration official. So yeah, there's been a lot of like anticipation, a lot of anxiety. Eventually, Tuesday came, and a lot of areas like parking lots of Home Depots around the city, they were not as busy as usual. I went to some of them. There were some workers who said, we still need the work. We're going just to follow instructions to remain silent, but we still need to try to find some work.
Was everyone you talked to, were they aware of the on edge, or were there any people who was like, oh, I hadn't heard of that? Or were people pretty familiar with the threats that were made by the Trump administration?
For the most part, people were very familiar with the threat, but not everybody was familiar with all the little steps they could take to kind of like stay safe and not,
Got it.
So there's a lot of education that still needs to happen, but for the most part, I think that the flyers and all the information that's being delivered out there, it's kind of getting to people, and it's getting to people out there on the streets as well. I mean, but not to say that some people might not really know what to do.
Adriana, did we see a noticeable drop off in Chicago public schools, the number of students who attended school this week?
I don't know in terms of how many kids or like if attendance dropped by Wednesday. Like students didn't have class Monday and Tuesday.
Okay.
So we only have Wednesday. So there's no information on that I have. But I will say for Chicago, and we have these local laws that protect immigrants, especially because they prohibit, in Chicago in particular, the city ordinance, the Welcoming City Ordinance, prohibits city employees, including police, from collaborating with federal immigration officials. So, and then also like Chicago schools with the Chicago Teachers Union, they've established these components of what sanctuary schools are. So in the schools, officials have reiterated like over and over that they're not going to collaborate with federal immigration officials, that parents and students will be safe, within like the school areas. I mean, there is fear, I would say, because what if you're like waiting for your kid outside the school, for pickup? But at the same time, the schools have made this commitment to safeguarding undocumented or people without legal status here. Now, the thing that we need to think of is schools outside, the city, right? School districts in suburban areas. We also have the Trust Act, which pretty much prohibits local enforcement agents from collaborating with federal immigration officials. But it doesn't really say anything about, municipal employees at the municipal level. So in that case, I think we need to be paying more attention there in terms of like school districts kind of like developing their own sanctuary laws or their own policies, I guess, that would protect students within those particular, within the area of, like where the schools are. And that also applies to churches, like churches could be affected too, but at the same time, there is this kind of like there's a difference between what's a public space and what's a private space. So in a public space, an immigration officer can reach out to you and talk to you And that's when you have to kind of like really think about like, okay, I have the right to remain silent. I'm not going to lie, but I'm going to ask for an attorney, all of those steps. But when you're in a private space, they do need a warrant signed by a judge. So in the churches, for example, we need to still figure out like within the church what's private and what's public, and how can they also protect the people that go to the church to make sure like they won't be living in fear, not going to church. I mean, some churches have now have online services, but for how long can we sustain that? I mean, for how long can people live in fear? So I think we really need to understand how these sanctuary laws can protect us in the city, what we still need to do out there to keep protecting people, and understand the difference between being in a private and a public space.
Maybe officials won't participate, but like if you're a teacher and you put yourself in between like officials and like the door of a school, can you face penalties? Could everyday Chicagoans, even if they don't work for the city and they intervene, could they face pushback despite all of these kind of protections on the book?
I hope that people would be equipped with enough information, especially if you're a teacher, opening the door or like saying who's out there, or just really kind of respecting that place and that school and the policies that are in place. So they shouldn't fear that. But I do think that school districts are in the suburbs. I mean, they should be thinking about, okay, we want our families to show up. We want our students to show up. We want our community to feel safe and not afraid of the police. So what are we going to do? How are we going to educate our teachers, make sure they feel confident that if an ICE agent comes in, they'll be like, well, do you have a specific warrant signed by a judge looking for a very specific person? We really need to understand that and be able to kind of like arm ourselves with kind of like those tools to be able to really advocate for people, I guess, who may be in danger.
To learn more and to catch up on all of Adriana's reporting, please check the link in our show notes where we'll drop links to all of the stories we talk about in today's episode.
Do you plan your vacations based on whether you can speak the local language? With Babbel, language no longer has to be the barrier. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I went to Mexico City a couple of years ago with my girlfriend, who's a native Spanish speaker, so I just let her do all the talking, like all of it. I adored the city, and now I'm going to go back in a couple of months, but with my college roommates, who are a bunch of middle-aged men, none of us Spanish speakers. When I was younger, I might not have been bold enough to do that, but now I'm not anxious because Babbel has me covered. Thanks to Babbel, I know how to order a taxi, how to give directions, how to order in a restaurant, all the small and useful bits of language that make international travel easier. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by over 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or whatever pace you choose. And because conversing is the key to really understanding each other in a new language, Babbel is designed using practical, real-world conversations, especially the sort you need while traveling. Food, how to get places. Babbel's tips and tools are inspired by the real-life stuff you actually need when communicating. With a focus on conversation, you'll be ready to talk wherever you go. So I hope I'll see you in Mexico in a couple of months. Or, as we say, espero verte en Mexico en un par de meses. So let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting CityCast listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/CityCast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/CityCast. Spelled BABBEL.com/CityCast. Babbel.com/CityCast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Patrick, over to you in a piece of reporting that you worked on over the last couple of weeks. Sterling Bay, a mega developer that a lot of listeners may be familiar with, is trying to get their Marcy Street project built in Lincoln Park. It's essentially a 600-unit project. However, not all neighbors are on board, but the developers believe they can get it built even without the local Alder support. Kind of catch us up on this story.
For sure. So real estate developer Sterling Bay, they want to build two pretty sizable apartment buildings along the Chicago River in Lincoln Park on Marcy Street. One's 25 stories, one's 15 stories tall. And it sits kind of just across the river from their Lincoln Yards project, which has stalled for reasons we really don't have time to cover right now. But the Marcy Street project has been at least like 4 years in the making and has hit some roadblocks recently, especially after Alderman Scott Wagasback, who represents the 32nd Ward, came out against the project. Wagasback and other neighbors were against the project because they thought the scale was, too large. It didn't fit the overall character of the neighborhood, and they're afraid it would cause more traffic in the area, which is kind of a nightmare to deal with if you do drive a car in that area. And it's also important to note, and just kind of go over really quickly, like aldermanic prerogative, which is a very Chicago-specific code of conduct and kind of tradition that gives alder people pretty significant authority to approve or reject new developments within their wards. And so the project was rejected in December by the City Council's zoning committee, which at first would signal that the project would, kind of die and Sterling Bay would have to kind of go back to the drawing board. However, it still has life thanks to the city's Connected Communities Ordinance, which very basically is a policy that was passed in 2022 that aims at promoting equitable development, transit-oriented growth, and affordable housing in the city. And so Sterling Bay believes that Marcy Street project meets all the criteria to be approved under that ordinance.
It sits between the Armitage and North and Clybourne stops. About, what was it, like over 100 units would be designated affordable. And it's being built in a part of the neighborhood that was formerly industrial. And so there are definitely people in the neighborhood who want to see something replace this lot.
Yes. It's kind of talked about as this, industrial area, but it's kind of like blighted. Like not a lot of industry is kind of going on around there. And the sites where Sterling Bay wants to develop, nothing is going on over there. So housing advocates and a ton of, people in the neighborhood want to see this get developed. And so Sterling Bay, they're pretty much trying to essentially bypass Alderman Wagasback's opinion and kind of get this straight to the full city council for a vote. At a meeting last week hosted by Sterling Bay, close to 100 people showed up, and most of them, like I said, were strongly in favor of the project because, Chicago has a huge housing shortage, and this would go a long way in providing both affordable housing. I think the number is 124 affordable housing units of the 615. And the area could really, really use this development. It's still unclear when it will be brought to the full city council for a vote. But I think the main point is that the project looked like it was dead about 2 months ago, and now it's alive thanks to kind of this little known and, little used Sydney ordinance.
Mm-hmm. I understand the amount of congestion that could happen if, again, you're adding 600 units, less than 300 parking spots. The streets currently in that area aren't all 2 lanes in both directions. Some are 1 lane in both directions. However, given its proximity to transit, given the number of affordable housing, given just how many more housing units we need across the city, it feels like they are meeting the type of criteria we want to see in new developments. Has the Alder proposed anything else in terms of any other measures they can take to be more neighborhood friendly, since he's arguing it sort of goes against what the neighborhood needs?
Yeah, he hasn't really proposed any changes. And I would have to agree with you. And especially just kind of tying it back to the issue about traffic. I've been to 2 or 3 of these Sterling Bay meetings, and, they're always really well attended by housing advocates and just kind of neighbors in the area. And a lot of the times people will raise their hands like, oh, who drove here and who came here, who walked here, who biked here, who took the train or bus here. And barely any people raised their hands to say like, oh, they drove here. And I think that's kind of the kind of main sticking point when it comes to some of the, traffic issues. Like people who want buildings like this to be built, they are less concerned about traffic because these are not people who typically drive cars. They're people who are using public transit. They're using CTA. They're biking around.
Patrick, to another story you wrote about Wax Trax Records, long-term old school record label in the city of Chicago. They're pushing to get their former home in Lincoln Park landmarked. How is that fight going?
So it's going actually really well. They recently had a hearing this past Friday, but it was kind of like the part 2 of a 3-part kind of process with the landmarking committee with the city. And some of my favorite stories that I've been able to write at Block Club are these kind of deep dives on historically significant businesses and buildings. And so, yeah, the most recent one I did was about this 2-story building on Lincoln Avenue that was once home to Wax Trax Records. It was mainly a record label and a storefront. It was founded in Denver in 1974, and then the crew relocated to Lincoln Park in 1978. And yeah, it really kind of quickly became a cultural hub for underground music and art and fashion in Chicago. And the 2 founders of the company, Jim Nash and Danny Flesher, they were kind of, pioneers of the music scene in Chicago and really built a community for people who were into alternative punk and metal music, but they also created a space for people who felt like outcasts or outsiders at a time when there really wasn't like a physical space to celebrate that kind of stuff. And so fast forward to today. So the company is owned by Julia Nash, the daughter of Jim Nash, and Julia's husband, Mark. So they run the company's like online website. So they do not operate out of that building on Lincoln Avenue anymore. And they, don't own that building and someone else owns it, but it's actually up for sale. And so they're trying to get the building landmarked to preserve the exterior of the building and to really kind of celebrate and, kind of mark this building as an establishment and just kind of, celebrate the history of it. It's on its way to becoming a landmark, but it could hit some snags in that process just because they don't own the building and the current owner of the building is trying to sell it. And that kind of complicates what city council and the landmark commission will decide to do with it. So it's passed 2 out of the 3 tests as far as getting it landmarked. And the third final test is February 7th, it will be voted on.
We're going to drop a link in our show notes. One of my favorite parts was reading when you referenced a quote from Richard Giraldi, who said, as important as chess records was to blues and soul music, Chicago's Wax Trax imprint was just as significant to the punk, rock, new wave, and industrial genres. Every single episode of CityCast Chicago ends the same way, and that is with me begging you to bring your ass back for the next episode. But before we do that, we always end with some good news. Adriana, what is your good news for us today?
Okay, well, I've been so busy covering like the anticipation of these potential threats of deportations that I just been glued to my phone and I just been driving around talking to people. But somehow I managed to make time to just finish this one book that I really enjoyed reading. I'm gonna keep it a mystery and not, mention the title of the book.
We just did an episode with Eve Ewing that came out yesterday that was about books to read. And so I was like, oh, what was the book? So we could add. And you were just like, no, it's my book. No. I'm gatekeeping. It's for me.
Yeah, it's a mystery. I really enjoyed it. I felt I connected with it a lot. And it made me kind of like feel like, okay, there are so many things I can keep looking forward to amid all the worrisome news that keep coming. And life goes on, and we need to figure out ways to just continue making it, interesting and fun and crazy at times.
Over to you, Patrick. What is your good news for us today?
Okay, mine is it's not in the same vein as Adriana's, but it's when she said this thing about the notion of just trying to get through some of the, really dark days and just kind of dark moments. And for sometimes myself and for a lot of us in Chicago, just winter is that. And so one of my colleagues here at Block Club, Molly, who covers the far northwest side for us, she has a great story out today about this couple who builds, it's like I guess it's like a 3 or 4 year running tradition now, and they're only getting bigger, but they build this like 10-foot tall igloo in their backyard. They go to great lengths to, build and expand. They like use these aluminum bricks, and they have wine date nights in their igloo in their backyard because they said, it's so insulated, and they're such experts at building igloos now that it's warmer inside of the igloo than outside.
They use the aluminum trays to build y'all 500, more than 500 of these ice bricks. And the pictures, one, I don't know how they get this many icicles in their backyard. This looks dangerous. Mm-hmm. Like, this is ridiculous.
It is super silly and very ridiculous. It's just one way that, people in this city are just kind of getting through the winter and just kind of exploring new ways to just pass the time, really.
I've seen a lot of backyard things in Chicago. And I can say this is the first time I have ever seen a backyard igloo. Even the pictures from inside, I do not understand how this is structurally sound.
But I'm sure the architects of it know.
They know what they're doing.
They do, yeah. And it's really up to the artist to, survive the build. And it looks great.
Shout out to Martina and Machej up in Edison Park. These pictures are beautiful. I will drop a link in the show notes to this story. And I'm going to round out our good news today with the play that my partner is taking her mother to see this weekend. And I've heard such great things over the last few weeks. And it's called Jaja's African Hair Braiding at the Chicago Shakespeare Theater. One theater I've actually never been to in the city of Chicago. This play is running until February 3rd. It has won Tony Awards. It's been on Broadway. It's making its regional premiere. And again, people have said it's an hour and a half of hilarious laughs, fantastic costuming and set design, and amazing performances. So this is one that I'm really excited to learn more about, to go see. But y'all, the tickets are going fast. It does, as of now, it ends February 3rd. There is a chance that it'll get an extended run. But yeah, get it now before it is over. As always, we appreciate you all for dropping by, for making time for CityCast Chicago. From WBEZ, Adriana Cardona Magigad, thank you for making time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And from Block Club Chicago, Patrick Philbin.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a blast.
One more thing before you switch to your next podcast or close out the app. Join me in thanking everybody who makes this podcast and newsletter possible. Shout out to our executive producer, Simone Alisea, our producer, Michelle Navarro, our Hey Chicago senior newsletter editor, Sydney Madden. Our roving newsletter editor this week was Adrian Gonzalez. The music we all love is from Sam Thousand, All the Kimonos, and Mark Greenberg from the Mayfair Workshop. And please, your loudest thank you is for you, the people who make time for CityCast Chicago. We're going to be back bright and early next week. Hopefully you'll join us. Peace.